thrilled to be moderating this panel that is being sponsored by my colleagues here at the Nonprofit Leadership Program at the School of Social Policy and Practice at Penn, along with colleagues at the Center for Social Impact Strategy. And to point out that this is a conversation that was originally designed to meet the growing interest among our graduate students here at Penn. But that interest is mirrored around the country and around the world. And at that point, when we realized that, we have now opened it up to the public webinar that I'm delighted to welcome you to. Let's get started. I would like to introduce our panelists, and I'll start with Dr. Abhishek Bhatti, who is an assistant professor in political science at Bowling Green State University. Abhishek's research focuses on nonprofit studies, international development, and global politics. He's a former social impact strategy doctoral fellow here at Penn School of Social Policy and Practice, and his work has appeared in numerous nonprofit and public administration journals, including the Journal of Nonprofit and Voluntary Sector Marketing, Nonprofit and Voluntary Sector Quarterly, and the Journal of Behavioral Public Administration and Foundation Review. Next, I'd like to welcome Matt Stevenson. Matt is the co-founder and CEO of Code to College, a nonprofit dedicated to improving the rate of historically underserved students attending and completing STEM undergraduate degree programs and entering STEM careers. Matt started his career as a K-12 educator, a high school math teacher, and later as a leadership fellow at Achievement First Amistad High School in New Haven, Connecticut. He was with New Schools Venture Fund as an associate partner, and then later joined KIPP, Austin Public Schools, as Director of Finance, managing a district budget of over 50 million. And now I'd like to welcome Ime Ho. Ime lives in Washington, D.C., and is the Executive Director of Resource Generation, which is a multiracial community of young people ages 18 to 35 with access to class privilege and wealth, all of whom are committed to the equitable distribution of wealth, land, and power. Ime was raised by wealthy Chinese immigrant parents from Taiwan and is dedicated to dismantling the model minority myth and organizing young, wealthy people for racial and economic justice. Ime has been organizing at the intersection of LGBTQ, racial justice, and youth movements for over 10 years, starting with Ime's first political home at Southerners on New Ground. Ime is also the co-chair of the board of the Astria Lesbian Foundation for Justice. So welcome, Abhishek, Matt, and Ime, and so that our participants today can understand the experience and the distinct perspectives you each bring. I'm going to offer a chance for each of you to provide some introductory comments. And let's start with Abhishek.
Thank you. My name is Abhishek. Thanks, Kat. I'm very excited to be here. I really care about this topic, and thanks for taking time to attend the webinar. And you know, when we think of racial equity and we think of philanthropy, we often think of resources, right? How much money are organizations led by people of color getting? And it's actually important. And there's a stark difference between organizations which were led by people of color getting the money versus the counterparts, right? So Eco and Green found that in their own applicant pool of 2019, organizations which were led by Black EDs were getting $20 million less. And we see the same thing happening. There's a greater scrutiny on organizations which are led by people of color when it comes to granting. And there's also the question of tokenism, right? You know, I give $200 or $2,000 to organizations and just like, okay, I just don't want to be seen that I'm discriminated in any way. But the issue which I want to focus more is about representation and equality and equity, right? And we see that mirroring a lot in fundraising, at least the work I study. So we see that when we think of what's happening around the globe, we have not been to Syria or Yemen, but we know there is malnutrition going on and children are dying. And the reason why we see that is because we see these advertisements in our news network, in our social media, and that has been hammered to it all the time, is that children are dying. And you know, this part of the world don't get resources and we do, and we are better than that. And that kind of enforces this stereotype that people of color are not able to take care of the children. They're not able to take care of their families and they need our help and we can help them. So we are systematically better than them and superior than them. And that message keeps getting hammered and hammered every time we log on to our social media account, every time we see a social network or on a news network, that there is less of that there, and the nonprofits really become a vehicle of showing these stereotypical images of girls, of single moms, and of over focus on this feminization of poverty and of people of color.
Right, there's a lot we're going to pick up on from your opening comments, Abhishek. Thank you. Matt?
Thank you, Kat. I was really excited to be invited to speak on this panel because this is something that I've been focused on in some way or another for the last decade. And I think when people think about philanthropy, they get very excited about the potential and the impact that they're able to see. But what's more insidious and doesn't get as much attention is how much white supremacy and white saviorism, something that I've written about, is embedded in philanthropy, and where we have this unique opportunity to influence and improve communities, whereas often is the case that philanthropy is actually used as an instrument to further use influence and gain influence and power. And so what I'm excited to talk about today is, for one, shining a light on that and being more vocal about that, something that is oftentimes difficult to do if you are a Black-led or another person of color leading a nonprofit, because the capital is in the hands of the folks that you would like to speak out about, and you are in a catch-22. I've been fortunate enough to be supported in our organization by folks who are excited about shining this light and who are excited about learning about how to advance racial equity in philanthropy. And so thankfully in the last year or so, especially given how tumultuous 2020 was, there's been even greater attention. And so I've been highly focused on using that moment and trying to extend that or protract that from just a moment to an entire movement and focus on advancing racial equity within philanthropy and for Black communities and other communities of color and historically excluded peoples. So thanks again for the invitation.
Great, thank you, Matt. Ime.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm glad to be here and happy to be speaking from the perspective of resource generation as also someone who is a young person with access to wealth and class privilege. And so all of the issues that the other panelists have named are things that we focus on as well, but from our perspective, as people who have benefited from a racist history of wealth accumulation in the United States, and now are aligning ourselves with poor and working class communities and to act in solidarity to address racism and economic inequality. And so resource generation, one of our primary worldviews or frameworks is that we understand wealth accumulation in the United States to be built on stolen land, stolen labor, and stolen lives through a history of attempted indigenous genocide, slavery, and ongoing racist policies that have benefited wealthy white people at the expense of poor and working class BIPOC, Black, Indigenous people of color for hundreds of years now. So structurally, this has actually resulted in the racial wealth divide, where 10 years ago, the median wealth for a white family was $110,000 and less than $10,000 for Black, Indigenous, and Latinx families. So you can imagine that there's a 10 times gap in terms of wealth and access to assets that has been created through racist policies over time, and that has only continued to grow. So if we encourage our members to understand where our personal money stories or how the wealth has come into our families is connected to this history of racism and exploitation. And then we use a framework called social justice philanthropy of if we understand that this is where the money comes from and which communities it was extracted from, it is really important to actually return the money to those communities that it belonged to in the first place. And so our social justice philanthropy principles really emphasize centering those who are most directly impacted by racial and economic injustice, trusting them to have the solutions to their problems and the issues facing their communities, and supporting their work with unrestricted multi-year general operating support. So that's something that we emphasize for all of our members, and we have over 1,000 members across the United States. And we also really ask our members to center a racial justice lens in all of their grant making and all of their thinking about other issue areas like education, immigration, healthcare, housing, reproductive justice, voting rights. All of those issue areas have racial disparities, so should center a racial justice lens when making grants and when thinking about annual giving. And so that's because we see a lot of trends of philanthropy about siloing, of trying to pull apart issues and fund in silos and not actually have an intersectional lens and addressing root causes and seeing how everything is connected. So I think I'll just close by saying, like, if we actually want to address issues at their root, then we actually have to center a racial justice analysis, because if we don't, we'll always actually be leaving people behind. Because then reforms or structural interventions will tend to benefit people who already have access to some privilege. For example, like the main beneficiaries of affirmative action are actually white women. If we don't center those who are like experiencing the most intersecting levels of inequality, then the solutions are not going to address the real problem. So I'll wrap up there.
Great. I'm glad this is going until 1:30 because there are a lot of conversations that have just been brought up in your introductory remarks. I want to start with a question for Matt, and then see if it ties into some of the great comments that Abhishek and Ime just shared. So Matt, you mentioned white supremacy, and then you mentioned white saviorism. What is that?
Sure. So if you've ever looked at seen someone's Facebook or LinkedIn or other social media profile, and it's a white face in a sea of black faces and they're smiling, it's typically a bunch of black children in Africa or maybe in some low-income community, that is how I would describe white saviorism in a picture. And I know I've seen it a ton, but as a definition, it's effectively when a white person, a white leader, or white-led organization is providing help to a non-white community in a way that is saving them from themselves or is otherwise self-serving. It's usually both.
That, I immediately think, as you defined that, Matt, of Abhishek's research, because I know Abhishek has done a lot of several studies examining racial bias in fundraising and looking at how skin tone, right, affects. So Abhishek, just invite you to pick up on this, and also given your earlier comment about, so often a lot of philanthropy is framed in such a way that that the potential donor is viewed as better than them, right?
Yeah, I think the inherent tension in philanthropy is there is a giver and there's a taker. And just because you're a giver, you are at a higher power because you have the resources and you're giving the money, right? And to Ime's point and Matt's points, that the resources are 70 to 80% of resources of the entire world are with the whites. So, they are in the position of helping. I think the larger question we have to ask is it just charity or sympathy, or they do really want to help people in long term, right? I think, and that's the serious issue to be, or serious question to be asked. And I kind of get to this through my work. So I run a simple experiment, and I ask people, so I asked their demographic information like age, gender, education, and their race, and I then asked them to take a skin tone implicit bias. So skin tone implicit bias is, am I implicitly biased towards a lighter skin tone versus a darker skin tone? And there is a lot of studies done that people who are a lighter skin tone, even if they are people of color, tend to get more opportunities in job, even in the marriage market. And that applies to Latin America, that also applies to Asia. And specifically from India, there's a whole issue of caste, which is embodied to the skin tone, and then there's a resource. So the skin tone is if you're more likely to be lighter skin tone, you may get more opportunities, and that means you may have more wealth or more money. So I asked them, so I did an experiment. I asked, kind of run this test. And what I found was that people who have higher implicit bias towards darker skin tone are less likely to give donation more than $10. So if you're more biased against somebody who's a darker skin tone, you're less likely to give them larger sum of money. And I think that comes from this racial bias, right? The darker you are to being of skin tone, you feel that you don't deserve my help, right? So I may still help you, but I'll just give you a small pity $10 and get over my guilt, because guess what? I felt bad for you. But I won't want to engage in the reasons why you are poor or you're suffering, or why there's systematic in which that people are not getting the resources. I'll just give the charity and get away from it. And that's something which is what I found. I think that kind of dials to what Matt and Yumi were saying.
So I'm now even more curious about the resource generation community, because Matt and Abhishek's comments really focused on the biases that exist, particularly between Black and white in the United States. And yet resource generation is a multiracial, multi-ethnic community. So Ime, how I would just love your comment on what your panelists just said, and bring us in a little bit more into how the resource generation model does work.
Yeah, so I think one really important part of our model is that, just to clarify, we actually aren't a foundation or a grant maker. We are a membership based, and we organize individuals. And a big part of our model is actually using personal storytelling. So how in this country, we actually have a huge taboo around talking about money, talking about class, talking about salaries. I think this taboo really invisibilizes real class differences and nuance. I think there was a study that, like, if most people, when asked in the United States, what's your class background, they'll say they're middle class, regardless if they're making $10,000 a year or $200,000 a year. People will just say, I'm middle class. And there's actually that really obscures the actual inequalities happening in the United States around class. And so one of our first activities that we ask our members to do is actually talk about your money story, talk about how my personal story around how my family accumulated wealth is actually connected to the racial wealth divide. And to this point that, the racial wealth divide does show that white people disproportionately, because of the systems of racism and the ways in which racism was excluding people of color from things like owning land or owning homes or other ways of transferring wealth. And then really it does show this big divide between white families and Black families, Latinx communities, Indigenous people in particular, and as well as the Asian community. But I think in terms of my personal story, in my money story, I think it's important to talk about, my parents came to this country as graduate students in the 1970s. So that means that they actually already had educational privilege, in their home countries of Taiwan. They had already gone to college in Taiwan, and so had some access to a social safety net through their families. And my grandparents and other relatives were able to pool money to send my parents to the United States in the 70s. And this is actually only possible because of the 1965 Immigration Act, which ended racial quotas that were barring Asian people from coming to the United States. And the Immigration Act was a direct result of the Civil Rights Movement. And in terms of how my mom was able to then break into the insurance industry and generate high income and wealth for my family, in the 90s and 2000s, she was able to break into this industry because of affirmative action that was recruiting women and people of color back in the 90s into an industry that was really dominated by white men. And so I tell this story because there is this really strong model minority myth in the United States that really pits Asian people against other people of color, specifically Black people. This myth was actually created by white people in media saying oh, Asian people just inherently are better, or they care about education more, or then implying that other people of color are don't, or are lazy, or just aren't working hard enough. And this very damaging reinforcement of a white supremacist narrative that, and I think it's actually important to show that, yes, my parents, they definitely worked hard. They overcame a lot of racism. They've been through struggles that I'll never have to go through. And they also have like benefited from the racial justice victories of the civil rights movement and Black freedom fighters. And so I think when I tell that story, I start to understand, okay, my family is an Asian family. We benefit from anti-Black racism in the United States. And so what is my role in acting in solidarity? Yeah, again, so how do I come from a place of seeing myself and my connection to access to opportunities and to freedom, like as part of a larger community of people of color, and not coming from it from like a guilt, shame, or like saviorism place.
So we've been talking a lot about the role of philanthropy and wealth, right? So money, who has money, who doesn't, who's getting more money, who's getting less money. In addition to money, you may emphasize some of the other advantages that people can benefit from. So I'd just love to hear everybody's perspective on other than money, right? What should we be thinking about when we are committed to racial equity and philanthropy? You know, people often think philanthropy, money, and yet, as Ime pointed out, there are advantages other than money that contribute to the inequality that you've all talked about.
I'd love to
Yeah, Matt, please.
Another reason why I'm glad to be on this panel is because I'm a Wharton grad, so go Quakers. To that point, I have access to this incredible network, and I attribute a lot of our success at Cote College because I've had access to this network. And I have now, over the last 6 or so years, lived in I think 4 different regions or 4 different cities, and in each region I was able to plug into a Wharton network that was local to there. And it meant knowing who to contact within local government. It meant having access to capital for our organization. It meant getting introductions for opportunities for our students, which I know for sure that I would not have had I not been a Wharton alum. And so that has manifested itself in great opportunities for us. But I've seen other founders, particularly Black founders, who have not had that type of access. And what does that mean? That means oftentimes you'll see you don't have the right pedigree, or you're not ready yet, you haven't been groomed, and therefore you're not ready for an introduction or access to this network that is highly, call it, whether it's prestigious or otherwise would sort of serve as a force multiplier for whatever they're working on. And so that is one way that I have tried to push myself, but also others, make introductions. You have no idea what it will mean, but you have to first grant access to these networks. And white leaders, white CEOs, white men in particular, are these tremendously powerful gatekeepers to power and capital and to resources. And I agree with what all of the panelists have said. In particular, Abhishek had mentioned that we talk about capital a lot, and capital is absolutely important, but capital is a means. It is not the end at all, and it's also not the beginning. And so I would say that access to resources is important. I would say, access to those networks, as well as access to resources, which oftentimes are, when they are undervalued, they are still withheld from communities that could use them. But those 2 or 3 of the things that I think are most important, along with capital.
Abhishek, Ime, you want to add any comments?
Yeah, and I think social networks really are important, but also social networks are in tune to wealth, right? If you need to have time and resources to go out and meet people, you need to have a car, you need to go and go to a restaurant and know how to drink a wine, and pair it with different kind of, so it is still class-based. But I think one of the things along with the network, as Matt said, was how you look. Right. So there are these 2 paradoxes which are working. If you should look poor if you want my help. You should physically look like homeless, right? So you should look worthy of my help. So the parameters of the looks are different for a poor or somebody who needs help. But at the same time, the paradox of being successful in the philanthropic world and in the nonprofit is European defined. And I would say go on to the larger life, right? If, but I find with the skin tone, if you are towards the lighter skin tone, towards what I call the European looks, you're more likely to get a job. You're more likely to get a fundraising job. You're more likely to be invited to the social network. You'll be more likely to get a pay raise and stuff like that. So, physically, how we look, which is biological, which we have no control on, also can open a lot of doors for us, along with wealth.
Mm-hmm. You make a quick question because it's coming up in some of the questions we're already getting. You talked about your personal wealth story and the wealth stories that other members of Resource Generation consider and share. And I know that there's a quiz on class privilege on your website. Participants are asking, is there any guidance for those who maybe are outside the age range for Resource Generation, but care about these same issues? Do you have any guidance for folks who can similarly reflect on their wealth stories?
Yeah, that's, I think just starting to think about it as like, it's actually it's more like a family history story, but then you're asking the questions that maybe, I know I was trained to not ask my parents about, like, what was your actual, experience growing up? Did you have a lot of money? What's your relationship to money? What were the messages you got about money, growing up? And, I think, yeah, many of us are kind of raised with a story of like, maybe it's an immigration story, or we hear stories about our elders. And I think just start from what we know, but then start to apply that lens of, okay. And I think also often in family stories, there tends to be the narrative of the like heroic man, who, yeah, my great grandfather came here with $20 and he started a company from scratch, and I think there's also an important feminist lens of thinking through what made it possible for that man to like acquire that land, start that company. He probably got a loan somewhere, might have known someone else wealthy in his family, or as Matt was saying, probably part of an elite network of only men who give loans to each other or gifts to each other, or it's because our great grandma had to stay home and raise all the children, or family hired domestic workers and nannies, and to start to really visibilize also the like undervalued labor of women, and how like women actually contribute to like generating like wealth for their families. And so I think that's one lens, but I think it just kind of start with what you already know, and then start thinking about, okay, what are the policies? Also, like, I think it's important to think through, and we have a racial wealth divide timeline that actually goes through, and I think this was actually like launched by like the Western States Center, so you can look them up. Like even back in the 90s, they had like all like just a history of all of the racist policies and wars and like occupation that actually extracted wealth for wealthy white people and made it really difficult or impossible for Black people, Indigenous people, and people of color to acquire wealth. So things like the GI Bill, which like benefited white veterans from World War II, gave them access to college, but Black people didn't have access to, for example. And so to start thinking about like, oh, did my grandfather like go to college from the GI Bill? And just like really start applying that analysis of like, what do I know about like the history of America, and how does that actually apply to my family?
Mm-hmm. As I'm monitoring the Q&A in both the chat, there are lots of requests for resources to follow up and learn more about some of the topics that you're covering. And so maybe I'll just flag if as organizers, so I'm looking at my colleagues from the School of Social Policy and Practice, maybe we can get recommendations from the three of you and provide them to the participants here. Quick poll for all of you. If you can give me a thumbs up. Have you ever been the only person of color in a room? Have you ever been the only person of your race or ethnicity in a room? Have you ever been the only person roughly of your age range in a room? The only person of your gender in a room? Okay. Let's talk about tokenism. And I will just sort of throw that word out to you, given the thumbs up that I saw, and ask you to reflect on that in relation to racial equity and philanthropy. So I know that's everybody on this panel has lived experience. We've all talked about the concentration of wealth and this notion that white people have more wealth, therefore, at least particularly in the United States, they would be overrepresented when it comes to who has the philanthropy. So the role of tokenism in racial equity and philanthropy. Just a little topic.
Sure, I'll go. So one thing that's thematic in philanthropy is storytelling. And it's important to be evocative with your stories. And Abhishek had alluded to this about, well, I need you to look a little bit darker, or I need you to look a little bit poorer. I need you to look a certain way to evoke the philanthropy that we're seeking, or to maximize giving. And it's actually quite harmful, the tokenism that happens within philanthropy, in that to seek dollars, there is this storytelling that happens to dramatize situations in order to gain access to capital. These students are destitute, and they come from single parent households and the inner city, and they're just sort of these dog whistles that are used to be evocative of, they're poor, they're Black, or at least really dark, and they need help, right? It goes back to that white saviorism, and it's like, without us, they will fail. And until we give that portrayal of they will fail without us, the dollars will not be released. It can't be. There are inequities in this system that are structural, that are socioeconomic, and we need to correct it. It's, without your help, this won't happen. And so that's the macro. In my own experience, it is fun, and it is, cocktail hour fodder to say, that's the one Black guy, and he went to Wharton, and he worked at Goldman Sachs, and we should give him money because he's one of the good ones, And it's kind of like Ime's model minority. It's like, it's a unicorn. Like, there's a Black man who went to an Ivy League institution. I mean, he's okay. He's all right. And also, he's safe, which I know that there's this subtext of, he's not one of them. So that is just another form of the tokenism that says he is okay to give money to because he's checked our boxes. So it's as a result, capital does not get distributed in an equitable way, and it perpetuates and magnifies just the ills that we already see.
Other comments?
Yeah,
Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's, you also see that, like, classism and class privilege does manifest often in this, like, very paternalistic worldview. Like, somehow I must know better than your own experience. That's I see that as a class privilege pattern across all races, that because there's so much messaging around somehow having more money creates more expertise, or makes you a better person, and there's a lot of condescension and paternalizing that happens. And so one of the ways we really try to actively organize against that is to yeah, like really ask people to not center their own experiences and like trust that people who actually have the experiences know what they need and that they actually have the solutions, and that having money doesn't make us automatic experts. And so we do a lot of work around how can we share our decision-making power, because I also see that as part of the like problem in philanthropy is that individuals and philanthropic institutions are pretty much unaccountable. Like there's no one to really have to answer to in terms of yeah, it's just like, you know, if I like it and it's my hobby and I want to like start a museum or put my name on a building, then I can just do it. And I think, yeah, one way to counter that kind of like paternalism or tokenism is to like we really emphasize like, you know, bringing poor working class or like BIPOC communities onto your board, like really that like shared decision making, like coming back to like who actually has the power to make decisions about where grants go and how money is used. It shouldn't actually be. We should also be distributing that power like to frontline communities. And so we often that's kind of how our organization is structured in terms of a cross-class board and a cross-class staff. And then we also encourage our members to give to public foundations, social justice funds, intermediaries that have like activist-led grant making or ways to structure it so that the people who are like being impacted by the issue actually make decisions about where money goes. And so I'm pretty excited about that model as a way to like fight tokenism.
Mm-hmm. Abhishek, did you want to add something?
Yeah, and I see that especially in the fundraising, there is some kind of an exhibition effect, right? So what was Matt was saying. So we kind of bring this one person who's visibly kind of overcome the challenges and then say, hey, because of your help, this person has made. And then he tells his story or she tells the story, you know, I was raised by a single mom, I had nothing, my father was abusive or whatever. And you are now my parents. You are my foster parents. And while you're having your wine and cheese, you write me a big check and then, you know, and that will help me. So that kind of creates this exhibition and kind of an objectification. And in my previous work, I've seen that you know, I was kind of involved with fundraising events. So we work with homeless children and then we kind of train them to do this exhibition effect, right? So we get a bunch of donors involved and then we see these children, they tell their stories and we will visibly pick the ones who will feel can compare. So bad hair, more darker skin. We may give a t-shirt of the organization, but not the shoes and not the skirt or not the shorts because they have to look poor. If they buy all new clothes, then they are not poor and that will not provoke sympathy from the donors, right? Again, it's sympathy. It's not about really understanding there are systemic problems in place why these inequalities exist. And I also see, and most of you have seen, there's overrepresentation of girls and single moms in fundraising, even at least when it comes to international funding. And you know, because we think of men, I mean, it goes back to the whole colonization in the 18th century as danger. I mean, these are the people who will steal our gun and shoot at us. So how can we help them, right? And these narratives and stereotypes get propagated by the fundraising. And that kind of becomes a whole tokenism to it. It's like you are picked up as a unicorn, but also you could compel the others that, yes, you have been saved.
Mm-hmm. So related to this, a question from one of our graduate students. What's the panel's opinion between telling the truth, and I'll interpret that to mean giving a more accurate sense of the realities of these communities versus tokenizing, particularly when there's research that that certain kinds of tokenizing will be more effective in getting more money. Right? And how much should nonprofits, you know, kind of what's the responsibility of nonprofits to maybe protect donors from some of the truths? Leave it to a SP2 graduate student to highlight that tension. But yeah, could you speak, all of you, speak to the tension that student is observing in your comments?
Yeah, and I just want to jump in here. And there is a real tension here from a nonprofit perspective. They do want to help get resources, and those resources help people. I mean, there is no doubt about that, right? And then, you know, we are obviously suffering from, we talk about Zoom fatigue, but we are also suffering from compassion fatigue. Like, you know, we're tired of people asking, and we kind of avoid. But what I found in my research is that if people have an racial bias, they're more likely to give less donation than more, right? So they're giving for sympathy rather than engaged in long-term solution to a problem. And they just might just give $10 or $15 and get away from a problem rather than giving a big sum of money. And then to evoke that further emotion, we may have to show even more harsher image now, because, you know, their emotion, because we kind of, we are still asking the emotional side of donors, not the side in which to kind of talk about the larger problems or why these things exist and how we can solve. So, I mean, there is a delicate balance there. And I also feel that the people who we are representing or working for have a least say in the process. We don't go and ask the beneficiary, can I use your photograph? Or we rather, as a nonprofit, will tell where to stand, show the hut, get rid of the father, bring the mother, maybe bring neighboring children to say this is a larger family, because when we see a single mom, it does evoke emotions to help, and they are, I mean, they need help. But is that the true story, or are you kind of creating an artificial reality in which the donors, when they come to know that this is all fake, they will not give anymore? And you know, so you're kind of creating in which, in long term, you are hampering the growth of the organization, in my opinion.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So if to play back, see if I got this right, that actually those with racial bias per your research are actually less generous. So in the long term, it's better not to reinforce the racial bias, because you're going to be getting all like less money. It's those who are less racially biased are likely to be your more generous donors anyway. So don't be suckered into playing to the racial bias.
Yeah. I was just wanting to jump in there, because then there is a solution, which is train people to be less racist. Like, you know, there's actually like a pretty, and I would not use that as the tagline of my organization, but I would jokingly maybe say, yeah, like train people to be less racist and less classist. Like it actually makes a difference. And we've seen that in our own membership, that if we, I also wanted to say, I think it's really interesting that, yeah, there's so much pressure on people experiencing oppression to have to tell their story and be vulnerable and like have to like pitch themselves all the time. And I would say that our Money Stories exercise is reversing that lens back onto ourselves of, we also need to tell the story of how we benefited from racism. Like we actually need to, we're asking the people most impacted to like offer this all the time. Like how could we not also like be asked to really think about that history and be accountable to it? Like it's really unfair to keep trying to extract stories from people and not participate in the truth telling. And so there's that. And I would also say that like, yeah, like that's a core part of our model is, you know, building a relationship, creating a racial justice lens, allowing people to see how systems have created these problems, and to then actually really train people out of the savior narrative and like moving into a solidarity narrative. And we find that's extremely effective. People who are involved with resource generation give 16 times more like after participating in one of our programs than before. So that's $1,000 to $16,000, you know, that's like an exponential increase. And I think there actually is something, it might be counterintuitive, but there's actually something really compelling about being told the truth and like being, because I would say as wealthy people, like we also understand when we're being like pitched or like coddled or not, like people treating us, there is a dehumanization effect with wealthy people too, of like kind of, you know, people feel like they can't be authentic. There is maybe you're risking like getting money or something. And I actually find in our organizing, you know, treat people like mature adults who can handle the reality of like the system that we live in. It actually speaks to a need of like, okay, yeah, I might have, you know, maybe I have a trust fund and born into a wealthy family. That's not my fault, but there is a way that I can be part of the solution in a helpful way. And that's actually a much more long-term motivating thing than the charity framework.
You know, Ime, your comment reminds me of one of my favorite, I think it's a quote attributed to Mark Twain, which is, tell the truth, astound your friends, confound your enemies. So not being scared of the truth.
I was just going to add one.
Yes, please, Matt, of course.
So I have a slightly different take in that. I think it was a great question. I had to think about this one for a while, but it's most donors are not sophisticated, and they're not going to ask questions, nor do they want to hear nuance. And so when it comes to unlocking capital, I could say, this is separate from racial, but I could say, Code to College, we've got an 85% program ratio. So 85% of our expenses are attributable to program. Depending on who you're speaking to, that may be a lot, that may be a little, that may be surprising, that may be right in line. And it's very difficult to tailor your message to every specific donor. And not to mention, you catch them on the wrong day, they feel something completely different. And I think there's this tension as a nonprofit leader to engage first, educate after. Absolutely want to educate you on the realities of, just because I'm serving a student who's Black or Latino, that they may not be poor. In fact, they may not even be middle class. And so while you think, wow, this is incredible, we got this Black student into an internship, they may come from a wealthy family. And that's also something that we have to wrestle with is yes, there are several criteria that we have to meet in order to meet our success metrics as an organization and to truly be serving underserved populations. But that type of nuance, it takes time. And I don't have several years to wait to get your capital to educate you to serve those students. And so part of my job as the leader of this organization is to give you a succinct message that's going to bring you in and to educate you slowly over time.
Well, in a way, Matt, you're kind of reinforcing the Center for High Impact Philanthropy's mission and the School of Social Policy and Practices mission, which is our mission is to educate philanthropic leaders and nonprofit leaders so that you don't have to, right? And so it's to recognize that the burden to shift donors, what donor norms are, can't possibly be on every single nonprofit leader alone, right? And I think many of you refer to there's a system and a set of institutions and structures that can either reinforce or impede the move towards racial equity. So one in this whole conversation, an interesting suggestion based on the comments people made about how there's almost this notion of the deserving beneficiary. Do they seem, poor enough? Abhishek's research, dark enough, right? The right gender, are they deserving of it? And often those that is described as, are they sufficiently at risk for me to give to? And one of our participants, or one of our attendees here said, why don't we start thinking of them more as at hope as opposed to at risk, which I thought was a helpful way to synthesize some of the things that you're all talking about. I'm going to play back some of the challenges that it sounds like philanthropy is facing with regards to racial equity. First of all, there is this notion that it must feel good as a funder, as a program officer, as an individual donor. It must feel good to be superior, to be the helper, not the person in need of help, right? To be in the good group, not the bad group, right? I'm sure for colleagues who study sort of the warm glow of helping and giving, that's part of it. Okay, so on the one hand, we've got that. And then, as all of you have pointed out, there are systems and structures that will reinforce the same set of people having that advantage of feeling good, feeling superior, being the helper, not the person ever needing to be helped. And sometimes that even, as you may pointed out, can come up in our own personal stories, right? Where we don't hear about the help that our parents might have gotten as much as we hear about the achievements that they made. So if that's kind of a starting point, Let's talk about some of the things that I know each of you in your roles and in the great networks you each have are seeing that you find most promising to change that, dynamic, to change that story. Whoever wants to start. If that's what we all are sort of seeing as the problem, what are some of the most intriguing or promising solutions that you are observing?
Yeah, I can jump in. Yeah, I think on the donor education and donor organizing front, I think there's, yeah, like, and to speaking this point of like, we shouldn't expect like nonprofit leaders who are trying to serve a different mission to also then add a whole aspect of their work that it's also about like, you know, organizing wealthy people or educating wealthy people. And so I think I'm excited that there's, you know, Resource Generation is now part of like a network or ecosystem of several different like donor networks, such as, and I can put them in the chat later, but Solidaire, Women Donors Network, Way to Win, the Movement Voter Project. There's a new Donors of Color network too that I find really exciting in terms of Matt's point to, you know, there are people of color who are also wealthy and don't have a space in philanthropy to also see their experiences reflected and to also feel that their contributions as philanthropists are like recognized and to build relationship with each other and fund racial justice work. And so I'm excited about that there just seems to be more attention from wealthy people and people on the foundation donor like side organizing each other around these issues. And I think there's also some really innovative models of funding in a way that like centers those most impacted from like the Trans Justice Funding Project, which is run by and for trans people of color. And every year they recruit trans people of color to make decisions about the hundreds of thousands of dollars that they grant back to trans-led organizations, to Thousand Currents, which funds in the Global South. And they actually have an investment fund that they ask the people who are receiving the investment to actually shape the terms of like what is that going to look like. So totally flipping the power dynamic of instead of we have the money, we have the power, we control the terms of this money, like actually like saying like, no, the people who we say that we are in solidarity with, like they get to decide like what this looks like, you know, for them. And also flipping the like who has knowledge, who's actually expert. So yeah, like really, and Thousand Currents also has like an academy, like a training program academy, like that invites people from the Global South, women, Indigenous people, and they are the faculty, like they are the experts, they are the ones that are actually sharing, the wisdom in their experience. And so I think that's like models where there's like real opportunity for like cross-class like learning, relationship building and learning, and like mutual like skill sharing, and I think really starts to break down like the haves have not, or the like kind of paternalism that's in philanthropy right now.
Mm-hmm. Terrific. Matt, bright spots.
So is it just bright spots or also potential solutions?
Both. Anything that moves us forward, Matt, that's what we're looking for.
I do see bright spots. All right, here's, so one bright spot is last year, Mackenzie Scott, I can't say enough about her, but she donated $6 billion of her own wealth in 2020 alone to a number of organizations. I believe it was almost 400. And many of these were basic needs organizations, but a number of them were Black-led organizations like HBCUs and Black serving organizations. And what's particularly striking about what she did was it was not the typical foundation-based, long, protracted dog and pony show process by which most nonprofits have to go through. It was, she had a small team of advisors. They did their homework. They looked at specific communities, and they compared them based on equitable metrics, and then they gave the money. I believe in Q4, 3 billion of it was deployed alone. And I mean, there were no strings attached. Again, like it was like the anti-foundation model. And I think there's so much power. It's seeding power. The seeding of power is so critical to advancing racial equity and philanthropy. White supremacy, white saviorism, it is all about controlling the power, and it's who distributes the capital is who has the power. And she said, we've got the capital, it's done, it's out. In addition to that, so that's the bright spot. In terms of solutions, one of the things that is really the holy grail for nonprofits is unrestricted assets and funding. For those of you who are not familiar with it, unrestricted funding is you apply for a grant, you get the cash, or you get a donation and it is not earmarked for any particular activity, whether it be this is specifically to purchase a laptop, or this is to pay for rent, or this is for this specific staff member, or this is for capacity building. Why unrestricted capital and funding is so critical is because you are seeding power. You're effectively saying, you, the nonprofit leader, know what's best and how best to allocate these resources. Here it is, and that's it. And so there needs to be a lot more unrestricted grant making. There needs to be a lot more equitable comparisons. You know, when you look at Black-led nonprofits versus white-led nonprofits, there was a study by Stanford, and I believe it's the unrestricted net assets of Black-led organizations were 91% smaller than white-led organizations. And that right there is a clear example of the mistrust of the Black community, the mistrust of Black leadership. And if these are leaders who are in the community, of the community, who know the community, serving the community, they should be trusted with that capital to do what's best. They should not be directed in the use of that capital. I would also say, sorry, I got a lot for this one. Intentionality is so important. Intentional, and what I mean by intentionality, a lot of times, really generic language is used so as to create loopholes. And so I have said a lot of times in this hour, we've spent black. And that's not because I don't care about communities of color and other historically excluded and disenfranchised communities. It's because I mean Black. Black communities and Black leaders and Black organizations are consistently underfunded. When we were in the green room before we started, I was talking about the corollary between philanthropic funding and VC funding. You know, less than 1% of Black-led ventures receive VC funding. And thank God it's not that low on the philanthropic side, but it is still quite low, especially in comparison to white-led organizations. And so talking specifically about, not saying minority, because minority means so much, right? If you mean Black communities, say Black communities. If you mean Southeast Asian communities, say Southeast Asian communities. If you mean lesbian communities, say lesbian communities. But you have to be very intentional and specific with your language if you want for that change. Otherwise, you have exactly what Ime mentioned before about the effect of affirmative action, the main beneficiaries being white women. I'm sure that was not the intent, but that's the result. The basis of comparison is also very important. Again, I talked about the disparities between Black-led and white-led organizations. And so comparing Black-led organizations to white-led organizations is like gala apples to pineapples. You know, they're different. They're different not because of the competencies, they're different because of the access to resources and to capital, and because of structural barriers. So So compare them equitably. And then the last thing I'll say is just no strings attached. Not, we will give you this significant funding because you will give us a board seat, or you will give us 2 board seats, or we will specifically earmark it to this and you'll throw our name on that. It's like, no, if you are looking to make an impact, then this is how much it costs, and write the check. Thank you. And that should be it.
Mhm, mhm. Thank you, Matt, and lots of great examples of what you said, how to cede power, right? How to let others control what happens. Fascinating about the notion that you mentioned the difference in unrestricted net assets. So 2 organizations could have the same amount of capital, but very different levels of control, right? Where 90% of their capital is restricted by somebody else, right? So thank you for that example. Abhishek, bright spots and or things that are promising that can move us forward.
No, I mean, promising things. Matt was really thorough, and thanks, Matt. I mean, you gave me a lot of things to think about. That was wonderful. But I think with the bright spot, I think we are more capable of telling a more complicated story rather than simplifying the story. And I do feel that, yes, most of the donors, I mean, we do want to get their attention and then educate them, and that's true. But I think there is a decent amount of donors who want to be more engaged, and they want to know what really happened and how they can be more involved. And I've seen a lot of small grassroots organizations are able to tell a very complicated story, a lot because of the whole, documentary culture we are in. A lot of people are far more aware, and now we are stuck at home, so we all are watching documentaries at Netflix. So we are aware of a lot of things which we were not, and and that we could now, as organizations, rather than simplifying, tell the whole lot more complicated stories, and we do have people's attention to do so. So I feel that is a bright spot.
Terrific. Well, I promised that I would transition to Q&A, and there are lots of questions. So for some of them, I tried to pose them in the flow of our conversation, but I'm going to go ahead and start pulling some of the questions that have been submitted. Here's one. Sometimes nonprofits, and Matt alluded to this, can't be picky or can't necessarily take their donors on a journey, particularly corporate funders. So any tips or ideas on how to hold corporate donors accountable to the mission and work of the nonprofit organizations we lead?
I try as much as possible. So we have a lot of corporate funders, but we also engage them as volunteers. In fact, I think one of our corporate partners is here. I promise I haven't censored anything I've said as because of that. But we try to engage them in multiple ways. So, volunteerism, hosting workshops for our students, and then also engaging them in the conversation. I think while no particular stakeholder group should be guiding everything that you do, I do think it's important to collect that data and to hear from them. What is the value proposition? What are the benefits that they're getting out of working with you? And that's also a great way to align to understand whether or not it's the right fit, because they may be looking for something that doesn't align with your mission, and it's important to be very transparent about that upfront and on an ongoing basis. So I think having an open and honest conversation with them, and one thing for not in defense of, but on their side, I think it should not be transactional. It should not be well, they're a corporate funder and they're just writing a check, and you don't hear from me until I need to submit another grant. I mean, they do want to engage with you, and so that's why I do think it should be much more relational than that.
This is a question specifically for Ime. Do you have a specific model, or do you recommend any work to prepare boards to bring on Black, Indigenous, people of color members so that the white members become aware in order to minimize repeating trauma, paternalism, microaggressions?
Yeah, I think ideally some of your executive director or some senior staff or there's already some members of the board who are already bought into a vision around racial equity and justice for the board, and they can kind of be the champions of the process, or lead conversations about racism, lead an exercise around money stories, or setting like group norms. If not, and you're kind of really starting from like square one, then just recommend like having some external facilitation. There's a lot of experts out there who are doing racial justice like work. When it comes to philanthropy, they're like the Common Council Foundation, I would recommend, has like facilitators and consultants who like really specialize in like having this conversation with your family board of trustees, or there's and to not do it alone. Like there's a lot of models out there of organizations who have made this journey. I think someone actually shared something in the chat about their own foundation of like how they centered racial equity and like got probably diversified their board. So just reach out to your peers, and that's a huge part of our model too. Is just we know that like trying to tackle this stuff by yourself is very overwhelming. It's easy to burn out, and so just like find those networks and find those examples of people who have been there before.
Great. Abhishek, this is for you, and it's the implications of your research. So given your research, any ways that to change the narrative, to use fundraising as an opportunity to educate and engage donors?
Yeah, I think we kind of can tell a more compelling story, and it does require resources, to do a video which is well oriented and kind of not just doing just a photo shoot or something. But I think the larger issue is, do we consider beneficiaries to be equal? And I think there is that feeling that because they don't have the resources, that they need our help, they're not the same. And though not all, but some are feeling, yeah, I know they are equal, but they're not really that equal. And I think to reduce that, to bring them more sane to the process, for instance, kind of asking how do they want to get shot in a particular video, or or a photograph, or just kind of what do they want? Like, Matt brought up, like, we are giving resources to Black-led organizations, but not giving them unrestricted access to it. There is a transactional nature to this, and I think at some level we have to break that. At some level we have to say, we all are equal. It's just by chance we're born in a particular neighborhood or a particular household, and the fortune changed from there. And accepting this is the first step, and the second step is going and telling more complicated stories. And there are donors who are interested, and I think we could reach out to more larger engaged donors who to do more volunteering work, to be more married to the cause, than just to give $10 a donation and get out the guilt.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. This is for everybody. In your opinions, how do we differentiate between white saviorism and white allyship? Is there an overlap between the two?
I would say you're not being an ally if you're approaching this work as a savior. Like, I think just back to, actually you can't be both at the same time. To what Abhishek was saying, if there's an internal feeling I'm having that I'm actually kind of a little better than this other person, I just like haven't, that's actually a deeply seated belief in the way I act in the world, that that's not being an ally. Like that's, yeah. And so I think that's a really, that doesn't mean it doesn't come up. I think it's something to constantly interrogate. We're steeped in a society that actually has a lot of messages around saviorism and like some people being better than others. And so I think it's important to, in terms of like really approaching being part of like dismantling these systems of privilege, to like really be honest and reflective and kind of like, all right, when am I coming out of this, out of a sense of like guilt or shame, or charity or pity, and having a real practice of like reflection and like peer accountability around that, or like and structuring that, and versus I think the first, like, we know ourselves the best, and I think we know when we're actually coming, like our motivations are coming from a place of like superiority. And I think it feels different. I think we all have various experiences of truly feeling interconnected, truly feeling like we're in it with somebody, we're working alongside them. We have a stake in the collective success. I think that's the shift to being an ally. It's not I'm doing something for you. It's like we're doing this together.
Matt?
I just want to say, I'll keep my feelings about the word ally to myself, but I would just say that ally is a verb and it's not a noun. So I would shift the focus on it's centering yourself, and it's like, well, I'm an ally, and I would say just focus on the actions that are representative of being an ally rather than what you're calling yourself.
So maybe a way to recognize that is not, are they this label or that label, but are they helping or are they not? And if they're helping, then if you choose to call them an ally, you may.
Let somebody else call you an ally.
Yes, there you go. That's something. Yep. Let's see. This gets back to a part of the conversation where I sort of tried to play back what I was hearing about whether or not a potential grantee was deserving enough. And so the question is, as a funder, how do we go about evaluating programs without having to compare sufficiently at risk, deserving enough, when our particular foundation will never have enough money to go around, right? We get requests totaling $30 million, and we only have $8 million a year to give out. So it's hard comparing apples to oranges, to peaches, and coming up with a way to distribute what will always be, at least for our foundation, limited funds. So in a way, they're all deserving, but given the conversation, how do we incorporate this conversation into our own assessment of potential grantees?
Yeah, I can chime in. I think, yeah, ideally, are your grantees part of the decision-making process? You know, are the criteria coming from your grantees? And that doesn't solve the scarcity issue of like, yeah, there's going to be more requests than we're able to fulfill, but at least then the people being impacted actually have a say in how that goes. And, you know, I think we really, as part of our social justice philanthropy principles, we really actually talk about some of the most underfunded work is like long-term community organizing, and especially that like community organizing led by Black people, Indigenous people, and other communities of color. And I think that's one way we try to, I think it's difficult. Yeah, like I think we try to like just say that we have a role to fill, and that like it's extremely difficult to get unrestricted support for long-term grassroots organizing. Most, you know, like it's still this model where service provision is like providing direct services, which is really important, tends to get more of the money. And so I think there's also something about strategy of like, okay, yeah, if, you know, we as an organization believe that like the most comprehensive radical change that will actually address the root problems of structural inequality are going to come from those most impacted doing their own organizing work over time, then that's where we're going to ask people to direct their funds. And yeah, there's still always going to be more need that can be filled, but I think there's some important and even within that, you'll probably get into the like, oh, but all these groups are doing that and we don't have enough money. And that's sort of like, that's when we're like, look to the ecosystem, look through the entire network, know that you don't actually have to do it all yourself, but you're playing a very important and specific role in the overall picture.
Just a reminder for everybody, I know this number sounds big, but in the United States, which is the largest and most structured philanthropic market, annually there's $400 billion that's allocated philanthropically, which is a drop in the ocean compared to the amount of money that governments use to finance public good and services, and compared to what the business sector has. So not only may you feel limited, but as Ime said, philanthropy is only one sector that has some responsibility for where we are. So I sadly have been keeping track of time, and I realize that our time together is running short. So we're getting a lot of questions about what do you recommend? And so maybe a last round that can be both a combination of and any closing remarks that you want to share given the conversation we've had, as well as any particular resource. And I'll use that broadly. It could be a person, an article, a book, an organization, an association. But if there's one thing that that you found, maybe you personally have found incredibly helpful in your own thinking around racial equity and philanthropy, if you could offer that too. So closing remarks for a minute or two, and then one thing that you've personally found helpful that you would like to recommend to others. And we can start with whoever wants to.
Okay, I'll go ahead first.
Thanks, Abhishek.
Yeah, I think that the question was about resource distribution, and this is not a new question. We are dealing with vaccine giving, right? We are deciding who will get the vaccine and who won't, and we are having certain kind of benchmark and sticking to it, right? So I think like one of the things is, of course, we understand that foundations don't have resources to fund all, but could we give something to them in return? Could we give them a feedback? Could we, if they've spent time on working on a particular grant, or could we connect to them to somebody who could fund them? And their small gestures take a long way, or give them an honest feedback about the proposal. And I know there are legal issues involved, but I think we could not look at a transactional, but like, hey, I can't do it, but I know somebody can, or if we work on these things, this will increases the chances of getting it. And of course, looking back on who we are funding and asking those, starting from ourselves, do I have the biases? And we do all have the biases, right? Whoever gets the wealth says he deserves it. That could be Black or anybody, right? Like, because we feel whatever resources we have, we deserve it. So kind of asking honestly ourselves, and then the organizations, of what has been the funding patterns like, I think is a very good way to start forward. And then finally, I think that to just accept that the world is not fair. And we know it, and then there are systems in place which help certain population and not for certain. And how can we kind of acknowledge that and help people who need our help, and treating them equal? And I don't mean to say it in just like theoretical way. I mean, it's a small act to a large, giving billions of dollars away. I think that could go a long way.
Great. Matt, closing remarks and a suggestion?
I think that this was a great topic for a panel. So again, I'm really grateful to have been invited, and for the panelists, for such a great conversation. I would say that panels like this and conversations that are very targeted and specific are key. I think, were this a panel about diversity, which I've been invited to speak on, given that it's Black History Month all over the place, is not helpful. So I think understanding what the issues are, having very transparent and rigorous and candid conversations are important. I think moving towards action is also important, but I think there is a reference in the Bible about we are all parts of the body. And I think that there's this tendency to think that within philanthropy, that you have to have capital in order to contribute, and that's not the case. Philanthropy is more than just dollars. It's involvement and engagement, it's advocacy. And so we all have a role to play, and we can all do something. You could write a potentially, $10,000, $5,000 check. If you can't do that, then potentially you could volunteer in person. If you can't do that, you could advocate to your employer or to another organization, or you can write letters, or you can call your state and federal representatives. There are a lot of things that all of us can do, and we can't do all of it, but we can all do something. And so I think just remembering that we all have a role to play, and that this is about ceding power and about righting wrongs. And that one quote that that is tangential, but I think it's important, that that I heard a couple of weeks ago that I loved was, you can be a masterpiece and work in progress at the same time. And that's what I would say the United States is. We got a lot of things wrong with this country, but this is a beautiful country that we live in, and it's time to right the wrongs.
Great. Ime, closing remarks for us, and any particular suggestion you want to share?
Yeah, I mean, plus one everything that Matt just shared. Like, thank you for that beautiful reflection. And yeah, I mean, I think I would not be the executive director of my organization if I did not say, if you are 18 to 35, and if your story sounds anything like mine, or you have access to class privilege through, maybe you went to school and your parents paid for your college education and you don't have student loan debt. Like, class privilege looks like a lot of different things. Maybe you were able to like travel to a second home during the pandemic. I actually think there's a real class conversation happening right now, because everyone who has a salaried job and has not lost like work right now actually has the level of class privilege and like security. And so I think if you're thinking about these things, you're looking for a community, you're looking for a place to get organized, connect with others, and take action together, please check out resourcegeneration.org. And if not, there's, I would also say there's great resources on our website for anyone looking into, like social justice, philanthropy, other foundations doing this kind of work, ways to give, ways to think about wealth redistribution. So just really invite people to check it out. And I think it's also important for me to share that, like, from, we organize young people in this age range because we actually, like, it's both strategic in terms of we're coming into, some of us are just coming into inheritances, or we're making decisions about money in a way that actually will impact the rest of our lives. And so if we start giving now, we're going to continue and continue escalating. And because I think, I know it feels really resonant for me to be like really tackling like wealth inequality, like now in the same urgency that we need to tackle like climate change, and the same urgency when you think about, like, is this actually the world that we want the next generation to experience? And I'll say, I know there's often tension intergenerationally of like, if the older generations made this money and want to pass it down, like both like what an amazing gift this is, and also we actually don't want to pass down wealth inequality to the next generation. Like, we don't actually want a world where only 1% owns like 80% of the resources. That's not actually the shared inheritance that we're trying to build. We're trying to inherit a world together that we can breathe the air and grow our food and like be in relationship with each other. And so I think to just start, I think there's like ways that we need to unpack what security like really means to us as like wealthy people, and to start shifting away from this. There are really like material things that are different because my family has access to money, and I know long-term security for like my family and for future generations is going to be about like justice, liberation, and transformation. And so that's what I want to end with.
I couldn't have asked for a better way to end this discussion, with the kind of inspiration and just vision of where we could all go, that I think all of us can embrace. So before I pass it along to my colleagues Stacy and Allison to formally close this webinar, just deep thanks to our panelists for an incredibly rich discussion. Apologies to those whose questions I couldn't get to. My only hope, though, is that the level of interest and questions and comments generated during this past hour and a half is momentum to go into the conversations that all of you hopefully will be having with your own communities, again, to move us all forward. So big thank you, Abhishek, Ime, Matt, and Stacy and Allison. I'll pass it on to you to just formally close us out.
All right, thank you so much, Kat. And thank you again to all the panelists for really a tremendous discussion. As you can see, the chat is blowing up with all of the praise. So please check that out. But yeah, we really appreciate it. And I also just want to let the attendees know that we will be distributing the recording. So you will have access to it, as well as for folks who maybe came in late or only came in for part of the event. So as Allison mentioned earlier, we will have it on the CSIS website, and I will also get it out to all of you via email. Allison, do you have any last words before we close?
No, just gratitude to the panelists, gratitude for your expertise, and gratitude to our attendees for being here and taking up this conversation in all aspects of your work and your studies. And thanks to the students last semester from the Nonprofit Leadership Program, whose conversations in our social entrepreneurship class with Matt actually inspired this panel. So very excited about all the energy around this, and yeah, just really blown away by this conversation. Thanks,
Thank you,
everyone.
everyone.
Thanks, everyone.